I'd like to welcome Kevin Werbach to Knowledge at Wharton. Kevin is a professor at Wharton of Legal Studies and Business Ethics, and we're going to talk about the controversial issue suddenly of net neutrality and the new proposed Federal Communications Commission's proposals that could affect net neutrality. And Kevin, I think the best thing to do, welcome to Knowledge at Wharton.
Thank you.
But the best thing is probably to start out with a thumbnail sketch of what net neutrality is for viewers.
Absolutely. No, it's funny you say suddenly, because in some ways this has been a sudden controversy after the FCC proposals leaked a few days ago. But in some ways, this has been a controversy that's been going on for the past decade. So network neutrality is basically the principle that internet access providers, which is the company you use to get your broadband service in the U.S., that would be companies like Verizon and AT&T and Comcast, it's the idea that they shouldn't discriminate in how they handle traffic on the internet.
So whoever you are, if you want to plug into the internet and offer information on the internet, you get the same speed as everyone else.
Well, exactly what it means is difficult and controversial. But the general notion is anyone can connect to the internet. If I have a startup, I may have very little capital, but I can get on the internet, provide my service, and reach customers. And I don't have to get permission from some company. I don't have to pay them some special fee just to get online. It's on the internet, and customers of those broadband providers can get access to anything that's there.
Okay, so the FCC is proposing some changes. There's a lot of hue and cry, some calling it the death knell for net neutrality, and others saying, well, I think you have a slightly different point of view. Why don't you describe for us what everyone's worried about and whether or not they should be worried?
The first point that's important to understand is where we are today. So at this moment in the United States, there are virtually no network neutrality rules that are legally enforceable. There's some rules that apply to Comcast uniquely because of some conditions it agreed to for a prior merger. And there's one FCC rule that says that broadband providers have to be transparent in their network management practices. All the other rules were thrown out in court a few months ago. And that was after the FCC's prior attempt to impose network neutrality was also thrown out in court. But fortunately, the court in the most recent decision gave the FCC validation on the basic legal theory they used. The big question up until then was, does the FCC even have jurisdiction to address these issues? Because the FCC regulates telephone service, television, and so forth. And so there was an argument that they couldn't impose rules on internet services. The court, for the first time, said, yes, they do under the kind of legal theory they were using. They just couldn't adopt the rules that they proposed. So fast forward to today, the FCC chairman, Tom Wheeler, has circulated to the commission a set of proposals to adopt network neutrality rules, to ban blocking of traffic, to ban certain kinds of discrimination of traffic. The rules aren't public yet. They're going to be circulated among the commissioners. If they're adopted by the commission, it'll be a proposal that goes out for public comment. But the concern has been from some quarters that the proposal doesn't go far enough in restricting a certain kind of practice, which is called paid prioritization. So the idea is there's the basic internet lane that anyone can use, but broadband providers might have more leeway to offer faster or better service for an additional fee.
So as soon as someone hears that there might be a two-speed service, there's certain conclusions that are reached, and they worry that, I guess, the two-speed service, well, in the beginning it may be a premium service that you can pay extra to get the faster speed, but in the end that the main lane would be degraded in some way. And so I guess they worry about protections. That's one point. The other point I think is interesting is that up until now, industry and all the stakeholders here have been sort of agreeing to certain conventions where net neutrality has been respected. And so far that's worked, but I guess there's, this is bringing up the idea that that could change.
Absolutely. It's important to point out that we're talking here about connections on the network side. So you as an end user customer, as an individual or a business, of course you have options of different speeds. You can go to your broadband provider and say, I want 5 megabit service, 10 megabit service, what they offer. We're not talking about fast lanes and slow lanes that way. The issue is for content and service providers. So if a company like Netflix wants to provide service to customers of Verizon or Comcast, whether they can be offered an enhanced delivery service. And it's even more limited than that because it's only an enhanced delivery service that is differentiating traffic on the broadband provider's network. The FCC has said that this doesn't address what's called peering, which is how the traffic actually comes into the network over the internet. So you're absolutely right. There are some very serious and reasonable concerns that people have expressed. The fact is, though, we haven't actually seen the FCC proposal. And what Chairman Wheeler has suggested in a blog post is that there are going to be some substantial restrictions on how those paid prioritization arrangements can be adopted. I think absolutely if there's too much room for the broadband providers to degrade the basic internet pipe, that will violate the spirit and the reality of network neutrality. But my take on this is that's not necessarily going to be the case if there's sufficient conditions put into place.
So why the misunderstanding? Why is it this proposal, which will then have months of comment and so forth and debate, why is it seen as such a threat by so many people?
It's a combination of just how partisan things have gotten in Washington. I mean, the reason that this is at the FCC is Congress has refused to act. And in fact, Congress has, whenever the FCC has tried to act, different factions in Congress have threatened to basically grind the FCC to a standstill if they don't do what those members of Congress want. So it's a very difficult and charged situation. Again, the FCC has tried 2 times before and has proposed rules that generally haven't provided what network net neutrality advocates really fully wanted, which is what's called reclassification. They've been advocating that the FCC change the regulatory category that broadband is under in the United States to be in the category called Title II that applies to telephone service. Now, what people miss is actually under Title II, under that telephone regulation category, you can do paid prioritization if it's offered on the same terms to everyone. But there's a perception that that's the only solution that will protect network neutrality. And the fact that the FCC has now said we're not going to do that and we're going to step back somewhat from what the previous FCC rules had said before they were overturned, I think that's gotten a lot of the net neutrality advocates upset because they see that President Obama and other officials have long claimed that they support an open internet.
And yet when they see that there's going to be, again, 2 prices, 2 speeds, they see it as, I guess, the camel's nose edging under the tent. And I guess what you're saying is we don't really know that for sure, but that the concern seems a bit overblown at the moment?
Yeah, it's always unsatisfying when someone who is an academic or a policy wonk says it's complicated, but it's complicated because it's complicated in several ways. Technically, it's very complicated. What exactly these prioritization deals are, how they work, the engineering, how they compare to all the other options that those companies have is a very complex subject. It's not that there's just one way you get from here to there on the internet. A company like Netflix has a whole variety of different providers it uses. It uses caching systems called content delivery networks. It engineers where its traffic goes, and it's paying for all those services. So it's not that there's this free internet pipe, and now for the first time there's a paid pipe. There's a lot more complexity on that side. And then on the FCC side, there's a lot of complexity. Again, what are the practices that go into effect? How does the FCC respond? What are the enforcement practices? And again, that's always going to be the issue. Even if the FCC adopted this Title II regulation, they would still have to make distinctions and still have to engage in enforcement.
So what do you think is the bottom line for people that are looking at this issue from the outside? They see this might be a threat to net neutrality. The issues are complicated. What does it mean, for example, for consumers? Will it affect what they're paying? And other stakeholders?
Sure. So 2 points. One is net neutrality is this vague concept. It's a buzzword. It's a slogan. But we need to walk back and break down what it actually means. What should people be concerned about? People should be concerned, on the one hand, if new innovative services can't get off the ground, can't reach their customers, or see that their service is being degraded. So people should be concerned about that, and if we have evidence of that, then that's something that should be taken to the FCC and to Congress and so forth to say this isn't working. Secondly, people should be concerned on the end user side. if they find, for example, that broadband providers are creating discriminatory caps, saying you get 50 megabit service, but you have this limit on your bandwidth, and only certain services are subject to the limits, ours aren't, and the limits are far more restrictive than what's necessary for network management, then that's something. And frankly, those conditions aren't covered under network neutrality, but they're the kinds of things that might make these harms that people are worried about come about. And then the big thing that people should think about is the reason this is such a concern is we don't have enough competition for broadband in the United States. We do have, in many places, multiple providers, but typically very few. And in much of the United States, there aren't multiple providers for truly high-speed service. So we need to do, and the FCC and Congress need to do everything possible to promote more competition. And frankly, the FCC and Chairman Wheeler has a lot of that on its agenda. And the question is, can it get to that agenda, or is net neutrality going to be such a controversy that that's the only thing the FCC focuses on for the rest of the Obama administration?
Could you give a couple of quick bullet points on how we would get more providers and increase that competition level?
Absolutely. So the United States made a choice, and I think, frankly, a wrong choice about 10 or 15 years ago, which is different than just about every other country in the world. I did a benchmarking study on fixed broadband for the OECD, which is about 40 countries around the world, the developed countries in the world. And the United States was one of the only ones that didn't require a form of what's called open access, that didn't require the high-speed broadband providers to share their networks. So we didn't go down that path, and at this point, politically, it's very unlikely we will. So we need to think about alternate physical platforms. One of them is municipalities, cities, or organizations going in and getting access to city capacity, poles and conduits and so forth in municipalities to provide their own broadband network. It's a huge source of broadband competition in certain parts of the world, especially Scandinavia. Here in the U.S., we have laws that prohibit that in many states and cities. The second one, the big one, is wireless. Right now, wireless service isn't a one-to-one competitor for high-speed broadband. But as technology advances, in particular for what's called unlicensed shared access to wireless, there's the potential, at least for a chunk of the broadband market, that wireless could provide a viable competitor.
So one big hotspot.
One big or many big hotspots. And that requires the FCC to make spectrum available. It requires the FCC to promote unlicensed technology. And it requires ability of all those networks to interconnect with the existing broadband infrastructure. And again, the FCC is looking at doing all those things, and I think we should push it to continue.
Is it reasonable for people to be skeptical about this sort of like post-decision enforcement that happens? So if we see a squelching of competition, as you mentioned, or if we see some degradation, then we go back to Congress or we go to the FCC, and yet people have a sense that a lot of times that's really you're up against a brick wall. You know, once certain practices get underway, it's very difficult to go back and change them. There's a lot of power and money on one side that would like to prevent change when it comes to that. So are people right to be skeptical? We can say we're going to do this, and if it doesn't work, we'll fix it. But can we fix it really?
Yeah. So I'm more optimistic. First of all, there's a lot of power and money on both sides. Microsoft, Apple, Google, Facebook. These are not tiny little companies. The companies in the internet economy, frankly, are much bigger and certainly much more profitable in aggregate than the access providers. The point is, once you go to a certain customer, you have to go through that access provider. But if you look at the history here, every time there has been a major example of a network neutrality violation, for example, there was a company called Madison River that blocked voice over IP service. The FCC intervened, told them to stop doing it. They changed the practice. Comcast a few years ago was degrading BitTorrent traffic. The FCC imposed rules. Even though the rules were overturned in court, Comcast retreated and agreed not to engage in the practices. Once they had gone through that complaint process and the public scrutiny, they didn't want to have it happen again. So it's right to say hold the FCC's feet to the fire. But something important to remember is that additional requirement in net neutrality that I alluded to earlier, the transparency requirement, which the FCC apparently is going to beef up. If the light of day shines on the practices of broadband providers, then there's opportunities for pressure. And we've seen the effects of this. So it's not net neutrality, but Netflix has a chart that shows broadband performance from their streams from all providers. And they've made a lot of hay by showing companies like Comcast that are out there all the time advertising how fast our service is and how great it is. They're way below a lot of providers, or they were way below a lot of providers that have supposedly higher speeds. I think that has an impact on companies like Comcast. And if there's more disclosure, that will help with enforcement.
You mentioned Comcast. Could this announcement, well, this blog, I guess, and those kinds of proposals have an effect on, say, the proposed Comcast Time Warner merger?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So legally, they're separate issues. The merger gets reviewed by the Justice Department, and it gets reviewed by the FCC. As I said, Comcast is already subject to net neutrality rules, and they've already said, sure, we'll put Time Warner Cable under those too. But in the court of public opinion, people are concerned that the big broadband providers are getting bigger, and that a company like Comcast, if it acquires Time Warner, will have even more leverage in this market. And frankly, if the FCC puts into place net neutrality rules that are less than what advocates want, that's only going to redouble the pressure to say, well, if you're not going to do that, then the least you can do is kill this merger. So I think there is some risk for Comcast, but as a formal matter, two separate issues.
You referred to possible municipal competition. Do you think that the government will ever view broadband as a public utility?
So it's hard to know what that means. So at some level, it should. And I wrote a paper a few years ago called The Network Utility, talking about how internet access essentially is a utility, but it's a different kind of utility. The problem when people use the term public utility is they're either talking about the Title II regulation I described. And that itself is not so problematic, but people need to understand that's not a panacea. People think, well, once it's a public utility, then all of a sudden those companies have to change all their business practices. No, not necessarily. It's just a different category of regulation, and the reality is it's probably not going to get adopted in the U.S. When you think about public utility, people think about the kind of pervasive regulation of either governmental or very slow, highly regulated industries like the old AT&T telephone network and energy utilities. And while there's some benefits of that, I don't think most people feel like those were dynamic, innovative companies. So if we want broadband providers to invest in new technology to give us higher speeds and more capabilities, then I think it's fair to say these are private companies. They should have the incentives of the free market. We shouldn't just say, well, let's essentially make this a government-run monopoly, which is what we're moving away from in every other sector of the economy. I don't think that's the solution, but I think we need to understand that they're so important to the economy, to daily life, to free expression, that it is appropriate to have different requirements for them than for other companies.
What are the next steps for this whole procedure and argument?
The FCC proposal has been circulated to the 5 commissioners. 3 of them have to vote for it, which is not a sure thing, because the Republican commissioners have suggested they're not going to vote for any net neutrality rules, and the other 2 Democrats want something stronger. So assuming the commission votes for it, they have a meeting scheduled in mid-May. It will go out for public comment, typically for 2 to 3 months. Anyone can weigh in. The FCC has already set up an email box for public comment, but there will be an opportunity for anyone who wants to go on the web and make a comment that goes in the formal docket. Then the FCC will review all those comments and will issue an order which adopts final rules. That would probably happen sometime later this year. But again, there's a number of ways that could get blocked. Congress could intervene. I think it's most likely that some version of this proposal will go into effect, and then we'll be in the realm of potentially more legal challenges, unfortunately, and this question about what actually happens. Do these fears get realized?
More broadly, what does the future of broadband look like in the U.S.?
Again, the fact that there is not more competition is a drag on broadband in the U.S. The United States is the world center for internet innovation, internet economic value creation, and internet freedom. But that's been weakened in recent years, partly because of some of the revelations about government surveillance, which have caused companies and governments to no longer trust the U.S. on that front, but partly because we don't have the level of broadband connectivity by some measures that they do in other places. So I think that will be a drag. And I think, we've talked to companies like Comcast and Verizon and so forth. They say, look, we are investing, we are providing these high-speed services, we are putting fiber networks into the ground, which by some measures we have more widely than other countries. But I think if you look at the potential, we haven't gone far enough. So I'm worried that at some point, even though Silicon Valley is here, and even though Wall Street, which funds so much of this, is here, and even though we have this extraordinary innovation culture, the smartest and best entrepreneurs and technologists want to come here from around the world, that's not going away. But I think there is some risk if we don't have a true national policy of promoting advances in broadband and more competition at every turn, that the U.S. falls behind, and also that we lose some of this potential that the internet has and that broadband has for catalyzing both economic benefit as well as all these great social benefits.
Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.